When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Welcome to You and the Law, a Chicago Bar Association production that focuses on matters of law and policy for the education of the general public. I'm very happy today to have a special guest, Professor Spencer Waller, who I'll tell you was actually my professor back at Loyola, and we've stayed in touch. He focuses on antitrust. He does have a new book that's coming out, and there's a ton of stuff that we may get into. We'll see really where we go, but we'll certainly be focusing on the subject matter of his forthcoming book. And I also want to thank him for participating in the Illinois State Bar Association Rule of Law Symposium, which was a bit of an experiment, which we held through a different organization in May, and it went off really well. And Professor Waller, you were part of the opening panel, and I just want to say thanks for doing this, thanks for doing that, and I'm interested to hear about your book and everything else you want to talk about.
Oh, thank you, Michael. It's great to be back here, and also to see you grow and prosper as an attorney. It's been a long time since you were in civil procedure, which is one of the other courses I teach, but it's a pleasure staying in touch.
Sure, thanks so much. Why don't you, and there's so much, we could spend a lot of time on this, but why don't you take a little bit of time and give us a little bit of your professional background to get us oriented in the subject matter for the program?
Yeah, thanks. I currently am a professor at Loyola, at the University of Chicago School of Law. I teach civil procedure and antitrust, and I'm the director of our Institute for Consumer Antitrust Studies. And if folks aren't familiar with antitrust, it's the body of law that regulates competition in the marketplace. It prohibits things like price fixing and bid rigging, generally cartels of economic sort. It prohibits monopolies, and it prohibits mergers that harm competition. And if you want one example, recently, I guess it was last year, Kroger tried to buy Albertsons, the grocery store chains that in Chicago are Jewel and Mariano's. And the FTC and a bunch of state attorney generals sued them and got an injunction stopping that merger because it would have been terrible for consumers and terrible for workers. And that was a relatively, it was a hard fought case, but a terrific victory for the government agencies it challenged. So those are some of the things that I do. I was in private practice for 8 years before I went into teaching. I clerked for a judge here in Chicago. I worked for the Justice Department doing antitrust work for a while and doing organized crime prosecution in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was in private practice with a firm for 3.5 years, and I've been teaching ever since. Part of that time, I was in New York City at Brooklyn Law School, and since 2000, I've been back in Chicago with my family and just teaching at Loyola, which has always been a great experience. And over the years, probably taught several thousand students, and look forward to connecting with as many of them as I can as they continue in their careers.
Sure. And hearkening back to my time in some of your classes, yeah, you did a great job, I think, among other things, getting your students enthusiastic about antitrust as an area of law. And I took a couple of your classes, and even because of the experiences I had there, I had the opportunity to be at the Illinois Attorney General's office in the Antitrust Bureau, which really showed, where the rubber hit the road. Although I'll say all the work that I did was really on one case involving a computer chip, and it was very enlightening in terms of how commercial mechanics and the kind of power struggles for resources have massive impacts and implication for the everyday consumer. So it really blew that wide open for me.
Yeah, and the antitrust is not just for kind of super complicated, big industrial things where you have to become a specialist. You do, like my first case ever was about um, bicycles, and my second case had to do with machine tools that make electric motors that go into your dishwasher or clothes dryers and those things. And you have to learn all that stuff to understand what are the harms involved with what's going on. But it really does affect human beings, kind of on the kitchen table. um, what do we care about? Rent. We care about price of gasoline. We care about the price of food. And antitrust has something to say about all of that. There are antitrust cases about whether landlords are using computer algorithms to conspire to raise our rent. There are antitrust investigations, whether gasoline shortages are the work of agreements or monopoly power in energy, separate from all the effects on the war in the Middle East. And um, it's gas. What did I just say? Gas, food, and rent. That we were talking about the grocery stores, and then the other thing that pisses everyone off is overpaying for things like live entertainment. And there's a case pending against Live Nation and Ticketmaster. And I don't think we're going to talk about it today, but antitrust just isn't a US thing. There's something like 140 countries around the world that have some recognizable form of antitrust that deals with these same general types of issues.
Sure. And I have, in the most basic terms, I've always conceptualized it, antitrust generally, is about protecting free markets, keeping innovation something that is part of it, rather than having companies with power stall out and fix markets, and ultimately benefiting the consumer and making consumer choice and voting with dollars something that actually means something. So I do think it was appropriate, for example, to have you there for our opening session on rule of law, that symposium, because you really opened a lot of elements with that, that were relevant to the conversation throughout the day. And as we get into the subject matter here, I'll just share this quick anecdote, because if I recall, and thank you, you sent me some materials of the book sent out, but I was kind of familiar with some very basic principles, but also had the opportunity to read some, the material that you sent over to me, or review most of it. And it reminds me, my first encounter with antitrust law, although I was not exactly conscious of it in those terms, was I was learning guitar by listening to Pearl Jam, and when I was about 13 years old, and all of a sudden I saw these guys testifying and talking about the business practices of Ticketmaster, and that's an ongoing thing, as we've just discussed. I mean, broadly, that was my first taste of it. It wasn't really until your class that I started to see, wow, these dynamics are prevalent in across many dimensions of our business and basically everyday life.
Yeah. So you're really talking about back in the 90s. And again, to sort of explain for folks who don't live in the antitrust world, Pearl Jam, if you're not familiar with them, is probably, they're still going today, but at the time in the 1990s, they were probably the second most popular rock band in the world, maybe second to Nirvana. It just kind of depends on, who you like for that kind of music. And they were fed up with dealing with Ticketmaster for different reasons. They tried as a popular rock band to create their own tour, not using Ticketmaster for the ticketing portion of the tour. And Ticketmaster had and still has exclusive contracts with many venues, oftentimes the biggest venues in the most important cities. And what Pearl Jam was looking for was sort of it's kind of quaint, it's 1994-ish. Um, they wanted the ticket price to be $20, at a cap of $20, and the service charge to be a cap of $2, something like that. And Ticketmaster wasn't interested in doing business on that basis, and had tied up so many of the arenas around the country that even a band like Pearl Jam really couldn't find good alternative space, and their no Ticketmaster tour kind of fell apart. My own involvement with this started when I was teaching in New York City, and I got a call from CNN, where I occasionally done things to talk about, like the Microsoft case and other kinds of things, to be on a show called Inside Business. I don't even know if it's on the air anymore. And I'm a young professor. I had more hair, and I didn't even have tenure. And I was one of three guests and a host. And Pearl Jam had a fancy lawyer from one Wall Street law firm, and Ticketmaster had a even fancier lawyer from another law firm, and me. And so the host would go back and forth, and they'd find out whether Ticketmaster was or wasn't violating the law, and what the facts of the case were. And the host would turn to me and sort of, well, Professor Waller, you're the expert here. What do you think? And um, I wasn't really judgy because I didn't have access to all the facts, and all I could do is understand what was going on from the public record, what I could read in the newspaper, and I'd heard that Pearl Jam's testimony in the Senate. And about the edgiest thing I was willing to say in 1994 was that if the facts were true and Pearl Jam was, correct in what they were saying, I could see why the Justice Department would take this seriously. And I explained what the law was. I did my best to make complicated things accessible to normal people. And off I went. And this was a half-hour show. And I went on vacation with my wife. And ironically, when it aired, I was in Los Angeles getting dressed to go to a opening of a tour in a venue where it was Ticketmaster only. So I'm actually watching myself on TV as I'm getting ready to go to this Ticketmaster arena show.
Is it at the Who production, if I recall correctly?
It was at the time, it was the Who's Tommy that was beginning a Broadway tour across America. And so when I got back to New York, 1994, pre-cell phone, pre-internet as we know it now, I'm getting increasingly frantic calls from my dean, who's calling me up saying, "Why is the president of Ticketmaster calling me and trying to get me to fire you?" And I said,
Wow.
"I don't know." who's the I said, why is it? Doesn't matter who the guy's name is. I knew who he was. I knew he was a lawyer. What I didn't know is that he was an alum of the law school.
Oh,
So
wow.
he was pretty mad at me. It's in the book, and we can talk about the book in a second.
Yeah.
But the dean assured me that I wasn't in any trouble, and he had made other angry phone calls about other things over the years, and he's
Sure.
entitled to his opinion. But what's happened with Ticketmaster is that things haven't really changed. If
Right.
anything, they've gotten worse because Ticketmaster merged in 2010 with a company called Live Nation, so that not only now the combined company controls a very, very significant position in managing bands, ticketing, managing, owning, or operating arenas. So if you're Pearl Jam, or let's say a less famous Pearl Jam, you even have less options. If you're famous enough to play at the arena level, you want to play at club, great, and but that's not how big time recording artists make a living these days.
Sure.
So in 2010, those companies were allowed to merge on the condition that they did not discriminate against independent bands, independent agents, independent promoters, independent ticketing agencies, or independent venues. And they continued to do so. And the government went back, and this goes back to both Democrats and Republican administrations. They went back to court and kind of tightened that agreement. It's called the consent decree. They tightened it. There were still complaints about Ticketmaster. It's just how they work. And finally, in the Biden administration, a case was filed to break them up, separate Live Nation from Ticketmaster, so that and get rid of some of the exclusive exclusive dealing arrangements, so that there'd be competition in live entertainment.
Sure.
And that case was going swimmingly for the government. And in the middle of the trial, the Trump administration 2.0 settled on very lenient terms for Ticketmaster, where they got rid of some of these exclusive arrangements involving venues, but basically promised to behave for the third time.
Yeah. Right.
Now, unfortunately, there were conversations that this case was settled. It's just publicly reported. I have no personal information one way or another. But it's been reported that the settlement was a result of lobbying and contacts with the White House, and that career people at the Justice Department and Antitrust resigned or were pressured to actually leave as a result of this and certain other high-profile merger things. Now, they weren't the only plaintiffs. The state attorney generals, a bunch of them, like 3 dozen, were plaintiffs. A few of them were okay with that settlement. The rest were not. They continued the trial. They hired a big-time antitrust lawyer and that guy's law firm to assist them, because now the lead plaintiff had withdrawn. DOJ was the lead plaintiff. And the states won. They got a verdict, a jury verdict as to damages. And now the judge has 2 things in front of him to decide. And it's going to really, the future of live entertainment and how much competition we have will depend on what the judge does and whether he chooses to break up Live Nation and Ticketmaster, and what additional relief he grants. Or is he okay with the basic outline of the DOJ settlement, where once again they pledge to not take advantage of their market power? This is part of the story, and we haven't mentioned the name of the book, and I appreciate the chance to help people learn about it if they're interested. It's called Power and Greed: Monopolies, Mergers, and Cartels on the American Stage. And I see, Michael, you're putting the cover on the screen, and I love the cover. I had nothing to do with it. They're the artists who worked for
It's
my
awesome. Great.
yeah, the artist who did it did a terrific job. I just gave little tweaks. And the book is going to be published by Methuen Drama, which is the drama imprint of Bloomsbury, and you can see bloomsbury.com. It'll be published on October 15th. It ends with a Live Nation Ticketmaster story, because that's what was literally going on as I was turning in the final version. It's available for pre-sale now on the Bloomsbury website, bookshop.org, Amazon, anywhere books are sold. And what it does is, I wish that the Live Nation Ticketmaster was the only kind of problem we've ever had in live entertainment, but it isn't. And historically, what we've seen on stage has been controlled by organizations as powerful as Live Nation. So even for vaudeville back in the day, in the 19th century, after the Civil War, vaudeville was sort of the main kind of form of popular entertainment. Vaudeville is just sort of a 2-hour variety show with 8 or 12 acts, and it could be anything from a famous singer to a famous comedian to a trained animal act to a magician, just a combination of things.
Sure.
That was controlled by two different monopolies, depending on whether you're on the East Coast and the West Coast, and they cooperated. And Chicago was kind of the borderline between the two territories.
When they weren't competing, they were colluding often or sometimes.
They barely competed. And then in the 20th century, the theater industry, commercial theater like Broadway, was dominated by first a straight-out cartel called the American Theatrical Syndicate from 1896.
Mhm.
And then there's a group of three brothers, and this is what I tell the story of mostly in the book, called the Schubert Organization. The Schubert brothers were three brothers, all of whom were immigrants from a Jewish family that were refugees from what's now either Poland or Belarus. I'm not sure where the borders were at that time. And they ended up challenging the syndicate. They ended up supplanting them, and for a while colluded with the syndicate to try and take over Broadway. They got fought off. The syndicate basically, a couple of the guys died, a couple of them went to Hollywood, a couple of them got angry and just went off on their own. And eventually the Schubert Organization became a monopoly, survived the rise of the movies, radio, the Great Depression, and by the 1950s were challenged as an illegal monopoly by the Justice Department, kind of like the cases against Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple and all the tech things today. Think about the movie industry was broken up in the 40s, the studio system, and then the Schuberts were challenged and the government won. And the court required them to break up. You couldn't be both a producer, the booking agent, who's how they distribute the shows around the country, and the venues. So what's besides the history of it, it's relevant today when the judge has to decide what to do about Live Nation Ticketmaster. To me, the closest analogy is live entertainment. It used to be vaudeville. It's still commercial theater today. I mean, Broadway's here in Chicago and it's in New York and it's all over the country. And the best way to ensure competition is to take away the power so that you don't have to promise to behave. You just have to behave, where people vote with their feet and buy somebody else's products or services. So that's the story I'm telling.
Sure.
Hope it's of interest to you and other folks.
Well, it's certainly of interest to me, and I think, and part of the reason I thought this was great subject matter for a program, in addition to the fact that I, of course, want to promote the great things that you do, but independently of that, trust, collusion, monopolies in entertainment, it's got its own flavor to it, because on one hand one could say, oh well, it's entertainment, maybe it's not that big of a deal, but it's also true that that informs our culture and gives us touchstones and places where we can kind of look at the same thing and develop a discourse around it. And when that content is flowing from a singular or even kind of like, several polls rather than a broad contribution by genuine cultural impulses, there are all kinds of other issues that get, whether it's propaganda, whether, there's just a variety of things there. And just like, so I almost could equate it to a free speech issue in the sense that you want market players in all industries. But now we're talking about entertainment, that you want plurality and you want dialogue and discourse. That's sort of the soul, of what we're doing here.
You
So,
want you want a variety of voices, whether it's live entertainment, whether it's news, whether it's production of movies for theaters or streaming. And
mhm,
separately going on today, this I don't cover it in the book because it happened after the manuscript was set. But Paramount's involved in antitrust litigation. Paramount was the lead defendant when the movie theaters were broken up, in the studio system in the 40s. But Paramount is being challenged by a coalition of 11 attorney generals led by California, because of where Hollywood is.
mhm.
But in terms of whether their acquisition of Warner Discovery will unduly harm competition, they mean both how much we pay in the movie theaters, how many
Mhm.
movies will be produced, whether the
Sure.
the quality essentially will be diminished to the lowest common denominator. That tends to happen when there's no competition for other competing voices to be heard.
Sure.
And in that case, the federal government didn't challenge it
Right.
in part. We'll never know until maybe years from now how much of that was the result of political lobbying and friendship and ideological connections between the owners of Paramount and the current occupant of the White House.
Sure.
So, antitrust, economics, art, even civil liberties of a sort are very much intertwined with this area of the law, although it's not what people think about when they talk about civil liberties. But having a free and competitive economy versus one that's dominated by private and sometimes government pals does take away our liberties in a way. And it's been an area that I've tried to raise those concerns in many ways. One small example is, will CNN be an independent, down the middle kind of um, TV station if this merger is allowed to go through and comes under the ownership of people who have a sort of a differing view of politics and what news should be? And that's not a traditional way of looking at it. It's not the same as if these two companies rig bids, are the taxpayers going to be ripped off? But it's in the
Sure.
same family of products, and the court will have to really wrestle with that. And though I think they're going to wrestle with, I wouldn't be surprised if the states tried to subpoena all the communications between Paramount and the DOJ and the White House that resulted in the government taking a pass.
Sure. And without getting into any detail, I can just and go kind of going back to our information environment. And I think the company's called Skydance that's associated with some of the purchase, like with I think it's Ellison. I think it's Larry Ellison. So you have a lot of these tech folks, whether it's Elon Musk buying Twitter, you see a lot of sort of tech, powerful tech folks getting involved
Yep.
in communications and entertainment. Um, yeah, and even TikTok, I would say you got some of the same players involved. So we don't have to get into any detail there, but there's absolutely sort of, in my opinion, a somewhat politically charged acquisition of some of the outlets, and I would even say, and I never really contextualize this in any way, but it can be even Taylor Swift became sort of a political. She
Sure.
got in the mix. I don't have all the details on that, but there was a lot of, especially around Super Bowl time, she became somewhat of a strange political figure without really being overtly political.
And an antitrust figure because consumers were really mad when they logged on to try and buy tickets exclusively through Ticketmaster for the Eras tour.
Right.
And again, the system crashed. A lot of times, prices varied even while people were on the phone, kind of on hold or on the web in a queue. And people began to think of, all right, what laws sort of uh, stop me from being ripped off? And some of them are consumer protection laws, some of them are antitrust laws, and that's again, gotten people to pay attention to these. And I analogize this to antitrust is trying to do in the economic space to create separation of powers and a system of checks and balances akin to what the Constitution does for the government, having different branches of government and various checks and balances between them. So we don't like having kings in the White House, and we don't
Sure.
like having kings in the economy.
Right.
And we have laws to deal with both of those, and some of those aren't working so well right now. And I'd be very concerned if antitrust became just another tool to rip people off as opposed to a tool to protect us as consumers as well as citizens.
And that seems like a somewhat, a perennial struggle in the sense that there are always movements, like you mentioned with this particular administration, not to get into politics of any kind, there seems to be a little more deference to the corporate mergers these days.
Yeah. And the companies that get all the attention in the antitrust world change as the economy changes, but the concerns are the same. If you go back to the late 19th century, the Sherman Act, the federal antitrust law, was passed in 1890, and the states had some state antitrust laws about 10 years before that. But if you go back, you had Standard Oil, you had what became U.S. Steel, you had outright price fixing agreements for everything that ranged from whiskey to barrels to nail to salt to lumber, all the things you need, for an industrial economy. And you had actually a cartel for live theater that was still touring the country by railroad, at that time. And you had the railroad trust. So the price goes up. Who gets the money is a small, tiny handful of people. The quality maybe of the lumber you get isn't quite as good. The quality of the Broadway show isn't quite as good. But then, as the economy changes, you get different, we don't have to get into the details, but you just get different industries that are on everybody's attention in the 1930s and 40s. There were concerns about AP having a monopoly over the news, the Associated Press, which was the only wire service and was keeping out competitors. There were Alcoa was the only aluminum company supplying aluminum, which had both tremendous importance for just everyday life as well as national defense. That was broken up after World War II. Then you got IBM as sort of the first computer company. Then you get Microsoft.
We're right at about time, and I feel like you could jump in. I mean, we really jump into so much here.
Yeah, we have to save that for another day.
Yeah, we definitely should. But I want to thank you so much. I think you've made it really clear to everyday folks how important this stuff is, and your book seems really interesting. And I think there should be some real enthusiasm about it. So thanks for everything.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you again, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to this episode of You and the Law.
When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.